Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we have a truly exquisite rifle to take a look at. This is a Type A trials rifle from the SMLE trials of 1900. It is in fact the only surviving Type A trials rifle, and this is what would effectively become adopted as the Mark I Short Magazine Lee Enfield, or SMLE, the really iconic British World War I service rifle. Now, this would take the form of a short rifle, as the name implies, which is to say that it replaces the two rifles that had served in the British military before, where the infantry had a very long rifle and the cavalry had a very short carbine. The SMLE short rifle here would basically split the difference. It was 4.5 inches shorter than the long rifle, and it was 5 inches longer than the carbine. Now, a lot of the impetus for the adoption of this rifle came out of British combat experience in the Boer War. They had troops there starting in the late there were several Boer Wars. The one that matters to us here began in the late 1890s, and British troops there found that they were really lacking in effective marksmanship. And their Boer opponents were really quite effective with practical marksmanship. And so a lot of the impetus for this rifle came from, we really need to be able to shoot better. And this wasn't just a long-range thing. This was particularly interesting in that I think it's one of the few trials that really kind of accurately reflects actual combat conditions. So typically a rifle trial is going to involve, aside from mechanical reliability and endurance things, it's going to involve accuracy testing. But when the British put together these trial rifles, the trials that they ended up using them in, and what they would do, let me back up a step. In 1900, they start this program, and what they really want is a rifle that is lighter, that can load faster, and that is more accurate in the field. The loading faster element was because the previous Lee Metford and Lee Enfield rifles and carbines had detachable box magazines, but they did not yet have stripper clips, or charger clips as the British would call them. So to reload the gun, you had to take the magazine out and reload it manually, one round at a time. For the Lee Metfords. Lee Enfield, you could reload with the magazine in the gun, but there were no chargers. It was all individual cartridges, and troops didn't like that. That was a clear message back from South Africa. We need something better for reloading the guns. And then they had significant accuracy problems with the rifles in South Africa. The rifles had no windage adjustment, and it turns out, believe it or not, if your accuracy standard for rifles out of the factory involves a group size, but no mention of where that group is on the target, you will get rifles that don't hit where they're zeroed. They'll have a fine group, the accuracy was good, the precision was bad. Or the other way around. I always get those two mixed up. At any rate, what this led to, there were significant complaints of troopers not being able to hit their targets. And it wasn't because the rifles were inaccurate, because the rifles weren't properly zeroed. The troops often didn't have good practice in marksmanship, and this became a major focus of the British military in response. So what we end up with is a rifle trial that actually remarkably reflects real combat conditions. So in addition to simple, basic accuracy at a variety of ranges, they did from 200 yards out to 800 yards, just how tight of a group can you get on the target, no other real requirements. They also tested things like snap shooting. You have a limited amount of time to bring the rifle up on target and make a hit, because the Boer opponents in South Africa tended to be very good about exposing themselves only very briefly and only exposing a small target, taking a shot, and then disappearing back behind cover so they didn't get hit. So the trial reflected that with snap shooting. They had vanishing targets in their trials, meaning that you can shoot at the target and then it goes away. They actually did troop trials against camouflage targets that were deliberately colored to look like the background environment. That's something that's really quite rare. They did rapid fire testing. Really, a lot of these trials that reflect actual combat conditions. I know I'm repeating myself here, but that's because it's really kind of a remarkable thing that they did. And they ran these trials with two different types of rifles. They had a Type A and a Type B. And they're basically identical rifles except for a different style of rear sight between the two. The Type A would ultimately be chosen, and that would lead to the SMLE. So let's take a closer look at this, and I will show you what the different features were in the new rifle. there were a bunch of really quite substantial changes that were made to the Enfield action for this new short magazine Lee Enfield. So let's see, if we start at the back, the bolt no longer has a dust cover over it like the early pattern Metford and Long Lee rifles did. They did that because instead they were introducing a charger guide, and this charger guide is mounted to the head of the bolt. So when you open the bolt all the way up, the charger guide forms or moves into place right there and allows you to use a stripper clip. This is a much later production clip. I don't have a very early one to show you, but the idea, of course, is that it sits right in there and allows you to very rapidly reload the magazine, unlike the single round at a time kind of fumbly way that the troops in the Boer War had to do it. So that's a major development. Now, there were some complaints from early places in the desert where these rifles were sent that the rifle was more likely to be gummed up by sand because it didn't have that full dust cover on it, but they accepted that as a compromise for being able to have this. The rest of the bolt was modified as well. There's no longer a safety catch on the back of the cocking piece. Instead, the striker is actually now a removable piece. So you can unscrew that and take the striker out, which is definitely an aid for cleaning and maintenance. The safety was moved to the left side above the trigger. Now, this style of safety was originally used in the very first Lee Metford rifles, but it was quickly removed and deemed non-essential. Well, it came back to being essential here now with the short magazine Lee Enfield, especially because this was something that the cavalry particularly wanted. They wanted a manual safety. If this was going to be a universal service rifle, it needed to accommodate the needs of all branches of service. So the safety comes back. We, of course, still have our volley sight here at the rear. So there's your rear volley sight aperture lifted up for use like that. The sights are a major significant element in the design of the SMLE. So what we have here is, this is the A pattern trials rifle where they have a tangent sight like this. The B pattern rifle had a sight that actually was pinned at the back, and instead of using this tangent curve to extend the sight for longer range, the B pattern, you would lift the sight up vertically like this and then adjust a slider up and down for range. Actually very much like the old Long Lee rifles. This is the pattern that was ultimately chosen after the trials, and so this is very similar to what you would see on the standard issue Mark I SMLE. Note that in addition to being calibrated out to 2,000 yards, it is also windage adjustable back here. So you can turn this dial and actually adjust your rear sight from side to side. This was presumably something that really came to the forefront after the accuracy problems and the zeroing problems that they encountered in the Boer War. Also makes the rifle much more compatible with competition marksmanship when you're not in a combat zone, and that is one of the best ways to develop marksmanship skills with the troops. And developing marksmanship skills was something very important to the British military at this point. That's something they invested a lot in, and it led to the BEF in World War I being by far the best shooting group of service troops in Europe at the time. Now, there are a pair of metal-capped protective wings back here. This would change form substantially on the final adopted version of the rifle, but that's where they put them on the trials gun. Note that this handguard is one continuous piece. That would also change. I should point out the handguard, which goes all the way out to the muzzle. This was something that was very much appreciated by the troops. They liked the fact that it made the guns much easier to handle when they got hot. It also eliminated a lot of the mirage. When the rifles got hot, the Long Lees had only a handguard at the back end of the barrel. And after a bunch of shooting, the barrel would get hot, and mirage coming up off the barrel would impact the sight picture. Now, speaking of sight picture, this is actually one of the other very distinctive features of the trials rifles. Both the A and B patterns had a complete sight hood over the front sight. The front sight is a barleycorn with either a bone or ivory little bead sight there. And that bead sight was intended to help with things like snap shooting, moving targets, disappearing targets, acquiring a fast sight picture. And this is something that the troops, there was a little bit of of argument back and forth over this sight hood. A lot of the troops liked it because it helped to give definition to the sight when you were shooting in bright light. It also aided in acquisition of your sight picture because there's no danger of accidentally sighting in on a protective wing when you have a complete hood. However, it was also argued that if you were shooting in a shadow, this cut too much light and it made the front sight dark and hard to pick up. So there was some back and forth. There was talk about potentially cutting a notch in the hood to let a little bit more light in. We'll see what they ultimately adopted when we take a look at the standard pattern rifle in a minute. But the trials rifles all had these full hoods on them. And, of course, they also have this very unusual, distinctive nose cap. And the idea here was they didn't want to hang the bayonet on the barrel itself. So instead, you have the lower forestock coming out and the upper handguard. This nose cap clamps around both pieces of the stock, but it doesn't actually clamp to the barrel in the middle. It's not exactly a free-floated barrel, but when you put a bayonet on, it won't, or it shouldn't, affect your zero. And that again gets back to the marksmanship, the importance of marksmanship that was being emphasized when these rifles were being designed. So you now have this heavy lug here, and that acts in place of the muzzle to attach the ring of the bayonet, and then the lug is hung a little bit lower on this same nose cap. So all the way to the bayonet is supported by this instead of the barrel directly. These use the same double stack, double feed, 10-round detachable box magazine as the Lee Enfield long rifles. So they retained that. They were, of course, still chambered for the .303 British cartridge. Another interesting marksmanship-related element, where the Long Lees had a single-stage trigger, they very deliberately designed the short magazine Lee Enfield to have a two-stage trigger. What that means is that when you are firing, the initial take-up of the trigger has a very distinctive end to it. So you have the initial take-up there, and then the trigger stops, and then you have to apply more pressure, but the trigger doesn't actually move until it releases. And you can shoot both very well. In my opinion, I personally much prefer a two-stage trigger, and I think it's conducive to better marksmanship. And, well, the British did too at the time, so that's what they very specifically went with here. And lastly, I will point out that they actually left the magazine cutoffs out of these rifles. The British kind of had this on-off affair with the cutoffs. They used them up to this point. They left them off the trials rifles. They will come back in the standard production rifle, but then they'll go away during World War I, and then they come back with the #1 Mark V trials rifles in the 20s, and then they go away again after that. So the trials rifle version of the SMLE had no magazine cutoff. Now, let's take a look at what was actually adopted. So here we have a short Lee Enfield Mark I, 1904 production, and this retains all of its original features and characteristics. So starting off at the back, we have the same threaded style of removable striker. We have the same charger guide mounted to the bolt head that sets in place when you open the bolt, and then it moves forward with the bolt head when you close the bolt. On the adopted version of the gun, they reintroduced the magazine cutoff. They decided they did want that feature in there. I do want to point out that there are a number of pretty sharp edges on these rifles. The edges of the charger guide here and the back of the receiver here, these are pointy and actually pretty darn sharp, and that's how they were originally made. That'll be relevant in a few minutes. We have the same safety and dial sight, or volley sight. The rear sight protective wings and the handguard changed here. So instead of just having a wooden handguard with some metal caps on it, on the trials rifle, the metal caps are much more substantial pieces. The wooden part of the handguard does not come up as high. This is a more substantial and a stronger rear sight protector that's put on there. Also note that the rear sight is now made in two pieces, cut in half here. One of the problems that they encountered with the trials rifles is that with this single component front handguard, this thing was very vulnerable to damage here, and it was also a little bit of a pain to take on and off the rifle because of the rear sight in the middle. By splitting the handguard in half, they prevented a lot of damage, and they made everything just simpler to work with. We still have elevation adjustment out to 2,000 yards, as well as windage adjustment. This one's pretty darn tight, but you can adjust that knob to dial in left or right windage. The front sight changed a fair bit as well. That distinctive complete front hood is now gone. They opened up the middle of the front sight hood to let in more light. The bead on the front sight was done away with. That's now just a simple barleycorn style of front sight. And again, there were pros and cons to that. So in my experience, this can be something that if you're trying to shoot quickly, you can accidentally line this up with your rear sight, and then you'll miss wildly. However, it does absolutely let more light in, and there are times when that's more important. The overall profile of the nose cap stays basically the same. Again, this supports the bayonet instead of the barrel. So 1,000 of these trials rifles were sent out, 500 of the A pattern, like this one, 500 of the B pattern. They were sent out to a variety of British military units who were instructed to run this rather substantial field trial, not just regular accuracy, but moving targets, disappearing targets, camouflage targets, and the works. They did that actually, by the way, they were instructed to first shoot the trial with the new short magazine rifles, and then shoot the trial with their existing rifles, either long guns or carbines, whichever unit was in question. And generally, the troops really preferred the new short rifle. There were a few complaints about recoil, probably from troops who didn't really know how to shoot very well, but the cavalry particularly liked these. They weren't in just the plain static accuracy test parts. They weren't quite as good overall as the original long rifles, but that was the Small Arms Committee figured that was probably due to troops being a lot more familiar with the long rifles that they'd had for a while, as opposed to these brand new trials rifles they were being handed. And they figured that with some familiarization, the accuracy scores would come up, which is true. And when it came to the other aspects of the test, the more combat practical ones, the short magazine rifle really did shine. So it was formally adopted in 1902. There were a couple quick back and forths. They made a few tweaks to some really minor elements of the design, which resulted in it being formally readopted in September of 1903. Production began then, although it was pretty slow at first, less than 1,000 rifles made in the first year. It was really 1904, 1905 when production really took off, with about 77,000 of them made. The SMLE would become one of the world's most lauded bolt-action battle rifles that set up this perpetual argument that still goes on today about which was better, the Mauser 98 or the SMLE, and there are some definite arguments to be made for the SMLE. Now, before we end this video, I'm going to make it just a little bit longer because there was a Mark I Star version of the SMLE that differs just in a tiny bit. So let me show you that real quick before we wrap this up. All right, we'll get through this one fairly quickly. This is the short Lee Enfield Mark I Star. And there were just a couple of changes that were made here. For one thing, the corners on some of these elements of the receiver were ordered to be rounded off a bit. They found that they tended to cause damage to slings, bandoliers, clothing when slung over the back. So this was adopted was modified retroactively on most of the original Mark I guns, and then later production would involve some additional machine cuts to soften these corners. That's one thing. The rear sling swivel was strengthened. So this is the original Mark I, which is drilled straight into the stock. They replaced that with a swivel that has a 2-screw, much stronger attachment to it there. They also changed the butt plate a bit. So the original Mark I had a steel butt plate with no trap in it, no storage compartment. The Mark I Star, they replaced that with gunmetal because they found the steel would rust, and they added a trapdoor storage compartment to it. And they got rid of the chain hooking the magazine to the rifle. So there's no longer a loop on the front of the magazine. So all in all, really a bunch of relatively small modifications. Probably the most significant one is the change in the butt plate. Naturally, to go along with the new rifle, they needed a new bayonet. The new bayonet mounting system wasn't compatible with the existing pattern 1888 bayonets. So what they did is they kept the same blade design, but they changed up the handle. And this new handle has a release button right here on the back, and it simply locks in to the front new nose cap of the fancy new SMLE rifle. This was adopted as the pattern 1903 bayonet. This particular one was made in the spring of 1904, and this wouldn't last very long. There would be some complaints about this, namely that the bayonet just wasn't long enough. This, the 12-inch blade on the pattern 1888 had been one thing when it was mounted on a long Lee rifle, but they're now mounting them on shorter rifles, and so the overall reach of the bayonet is consequently shorter. So this would be replaced in 1907 by a longer pattern of nominal 1907 bayonet, which would last through into, well, through the full service life of the SMLE. These today are, as you might expect, exquisitely rare. I was debating how best to cover the Mark I star, and I figured rather than make a kind of a wimpy video just about that, we'll throw it in this one. This video is long enough already. Why not toss one more gun in? Anyway, a very big thank you to the owner of these rifles for allowing me to take a look at them and present them to you on camera. As I said at the beginning, this is the only known surviving example of a Type A trials rifle, trials rifle. They made 500 of them originally. In 1906, 1907, they were converted into aiming tube 22 rifles for training because, well, they're non-standard rifles. What else are you going to do with them? And then in the years since, when the rifles broke down or parts were lost or they no longer needed them, they were scrapped. So this is the only surviving complete example. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video, learned something cool about the early years of the SMLE. Thanks for watching.